Howdy. Now, if you're a .NET developer who creates websites, you don't really want to learn JavaScript or you don't like it, then this is a video you must see. So in this video, we're going to look at how we can do static site generation just using .NET. Yep, this means that if you're using a headless CMS like Umbraco, how can we build our front-end headless website just using .NET without having to rely on any type of JavaScript framework? So what you're going to learn in this video is what static site generators are available for .NET. We're going to look at which one is the best, and then based on this winner, we're going to look at what features it provides, and more importantly, how we can host it and how it's going to improve your life. Now, for me, this was a game-changing learning opportunity. I hope it's the same for you. Now, before we get to the good stuff, and this is another long video, I do have to do my usual housekeeping. So first, if this is the first time you stumbled across my channel, then my name is John and I release a video every single Sunday on .NET development, so hit subscribe now before we move on. Secondly, all the code samples, all the snippets, all the related sample sites that you're about to see in this video, they're all linked to in a related tutorial that I've created below, so it's much easier for you to go through that tutorial while watching this video rather than trying to copy things off screen, so you're welcome for that. Otherwise, let's have a look at what these static site generators for .NET looks like, and should we use these in production. Before we start looking at the framework that we're going to use to generate our static web pages today, it's probably worth going through the process that I went through in order to select it. Now, just in terms of popularity, obviously JavaScript is the most used technology for static site generation. Now, out of the JavaScript frameworks, Next.js is probably the most popular one, and we can see that it's got about 100,000 starred GitHub users, and we can see it's constantly going up. Now, in case you weren't aware, you can learn all about all the different types of static site generators over at jamstack.org/generators. Basically, we can come to the site generators, we can filter by .NET, and we're going to get ourselves a list of 9. Yep, 9 things. Now, out of this 9, it's sad to say that this one here called WeAm has actually been deprecated, and it's been deprecated by this package called static. Now, if we compare this to JavaScript, you'll see that we have 131 generators. So I just wanted to quickly point out that if you start using SSG with .NET, you are walking down a road less traveled. And as you'll see later on in the video, this does actually have some consequences. Now, the next thing to look at, out of this list, which one should we use to generate our websites with? Now, in terms of popularity contest, we've got Graze, and Graze has been starred 140 times. However, we can see that it is slowly getting more popular over time. We've also got Ironbeard. So Ironbeard has been starred only 30 times. However, it's still slightly growing in popularity. We have ASP.NET Static. And as you can see here, this has also been starred around 40 times with, a little bit of growth, but not much. We've also got Last Page. So Last Page has been starred 6 times, not looking good. And then finally, if we look at Static, we can see that Static here has been starred over 1.5 thousand times. And because of this, this is the reason we're going to be using Static in today's video. Now, before we actually get into the meat of how you can use static and what it can do, it's worth pointing out that 1, there's a website over at static.dev, but more importantly is licensing. So licensing is free to use for hobby projects. However, if you're using it for a commercial project, then you're going to have to spend $50 per developer. So this is definitely something worth considering when you're thinking about static. Now, the next thing we need to decide is how we're going to generate the content contained within our website. And basically, static has 2 ways of working. Now, in the first mode, it works very similar to how Gatsby works. Now, if you haven't come across Gatsby, it's a JavaScript static site generation tool. And in order for me to explain how Gatsby works, I'm going to show you the files that make up a Gatsby website. Now, we've jumped over to overreacted.io, and this GitHub repo is owned by Dan Abrahov, and he's basically a very famous React developer who works in the React team. Now, this is a Gatsby website, and if we go to the source directory here, if we go into pages, you can see that all of his blog posts are basically stored in here. So every single time that he updates his blog, he basically does a push into this repository. This then triggers off a CI/CD pipeline, and I'm guessing it gets pushed up to Netlify. Now from here you can see that we've got an index.md file, and this file is basically going to be converted into an end HTML file. And this process works exactly the same as static's markdown to HTML default pipeline. So this is the first way that we can generate content within static. Now the second way is to use something called a pipeline. So a pipeline basically will allow you to import content from somewhere else. Now for me, it makes most sense to import that content from a headless CMS. And if you look in the marketplace, you can see that there's currently a contentful static integration or pipeline, and there's also a Kentico content static pipeline. Now, it's definitely worth pointing out that just because there are only 2 different providers in NuGet at the moment, that doesn't mean that you're limited to just using those headless CMSs with static. Now, it's possible to create your own custom pipelines with whatever headless CMS that you want to. The task is not too difficult, however, the documentation around it is not great. Now, I have got a question for you. If you're interested in Umbraco CMS and you'd like to learn about how to create a custom provider with static, then let me know in the comments below, because in a future video, I'm tempted to do a Umbraco static integration guide. However, if no one wants to see it, I'm not going to bother. So I need at least 5 or 10 comments below for me to do that video. And the final thing to cover is hosting. Now, typically you can't host a .NET website in a JAMStack hosting provider. So some of the providers are things like Netlify, we've got things like Cloudflare Pages, we've got GitHub Pages, we've got Vercel. Now, because we're creating static site pages, this can actually be run in Netlify because Netlify does support .NET Core v6 onwards. And personally, for me, this is one of the biggest limitations of using .NET, especially for hobby projects. Now, I've been hosting .NET websites for about 20 years, so I'm not a complete newbie before you try and blame me. But I think there's basically 2 real options when it comes to .NET. One, we can use cloud. So we can use Azure, AWS, GCP, take your choice. Now for a company, yeah, that's pretty good, but for an individual, it's a pain. Configure any of it wrong and you could end up with a fine of thousands of pounds, and see my previous video about my GCP account getting hacked to prove that that can happen. Now the alternative option is to use classic web hosting, and for here you're probably going to use a share server, you're going to have to set up a CI/CD pipeline, you might need to do FTP, you might need to do a web deploy, whatever it is. Now things are much easier in the JavaScript landscape. Using something like Netlify, you can basically just commit your code into GitHub and it can get pushed automatically into the cloud. And for me personally, it's these newer JAMStack focused hosting providers that are much more exciting. And the reason for this is most of the time they're free, we can have custom domains, we can store our pages in the edge so they're quick, the pages are static HTML so they're quick, the static HTML so the pages aren't going to fall over in the middle of the night, and not to mention that each one of these providers has a range of extra features. So we've got things like A/B testing, commenting, serverless functions, there's a bunch of stuff, and the pricing is very reasonable. So for me, static actually makes me consider using .NET in more projects nowadays. Now, I'm not going to cover why I'm picking Netlify in this video, because I've already done a deep dive video comparing Netlify, Vercel and all those options, which you can find in the related tutorial below. In this section, we're going to look at how we can create a brand new static website with .NET Core. So first off, we need to create a brand new console application. So .NET new console -- name, give yourself a project name. Now at the moment, static only supports .NET 6, so you need to use .NET 6. Now after doing this, you'll need to install the static NuGet package, so static.web. At the moment, you can do that with .NET add package static.web -- version, and as you can see, it's still in beta at the moment, and it's on beta.58 at the time of recording. For this video, I've created 2 websites, and we're going to start off, in my opinion, looking at the simple way to get started. So if you just want to create a simple portfolio website, or maybe a 4 or 5 page brochureware website, this is the option to go down. So you can download this sample site from my GitHub. It's called John D. Jones -POC, and the repo is called static sample site -markdown. So I've switched to Visual Studio. I'm going to start off by giving you a quick walkthrough of what all the folders do within this project. So first off, we have the input folder. Now input is where you're going to put all your CSS files, all the markdown pages that you want to get converted into HTML, images, all that kind of good stuff. Now the next thing is we have properties. Now this is really important for actually being able to debug and preview your website. You need to make sure that you have a launch settings.json, otherwise when it comes to previewing, things aren't going to work. No bueno. Now the next thing we need to point out is this theme folder. Now within Static, it's possible to install custom themes. Now when I say custom themes, currently I can only find a single theme. So basically what happens is that within your Git modules, you'll add in your theme, which at the moment is called the clean blog, as a sub module. Then within your theme folder here, you'll be able to see everything. Now, in order to install the theme, you can run this command that you can see on screen right now. Now, after that, the only things which are worth pointing out is that we have our program.cs. Now, within program.cs, in order to kickstart off our static site, all we need to do is use the bootstrapper method. You can see here that we've got await bootstrapper, then we do .factory. Now, because we just want to convert Markdown to HTML, we can use the simple mode. And the simple mode is using this create web. Now, when we look at creating custom pipelines later, this thing is going to change, but for now, this is the key thing. Now, the other things which are probably worth pointing out is that we have ourselves a Netlify TOML file. So this is basically going to contain all of our CI/CD instructions on how Netlify is going to build our project when we push it remotely. Now in here, all we need to do is a .NET run, and the published directory is output. And if you look in this output directory here, you'll see that once we build our project, all of our end files, all of our static HTML pages, it's going to live within this output folder. The final thing to point out is app settings. So if you want to define environment variables, all that kind of good stuff, you can use app settings and Static will automatically read them in. Now that we've got that covered, if we run to the terminal, do a .NET run, you'll see that all of our pages will be generated. And because we're running in web mode, then we'll also have access to the preview server. So when it eventually loads, we'll have a link to localhost and we can actually view our site. So you can see it's here, clicking on it, I've now got access to my website. My website's got some blog posts, it's got some tags, it's got a menu where I can have a look at my landing page, I can look at my about page, we've got some images being pulled in. We've even got ourselves an RSS feed by clicking on the link at the bottom. Now you've seen the site, let's look at how those pages and posts were created. Now, first off, if we look within our input folder, you can see that we've got our posts folder. And in here, you can see that we've got some markdown files because they've got an MD extension. Now, if we look in this pages, you can also see that we've got another markdown file called hidden.md. So if we look in posts, you'll see that at the top, we have some metadata. So this is things like title, lead, published, image, and tags. And this basically maps to our website. So if we go back to our website, we can see that we've got, post one, this is the lead. If we go and look within our markdown, you can see that we've got post one, this is the lead. Here's our image. My image is living within this folder. So this is basically all working using magic. Now, basically when we're using that create web mode, in the background, Static is going to be using its default markdown to HTML pipeline. So you don't need to configure anything. All we need to do is create these markdown files and off it goes. So that kind of covers how the HTML pages are generated, but now let's think about styling. So if we look within our theme folder, you can see that we have a matching input folder. And within here, we've got JavaScript, we've got CSS, we've got vendor stuff. So we've got Font Awesome, we've got Bootstrap, and then we've got a bunch of layouts. So we've got an underscore layout, which has got all of our site furniture. There's a header. We've got a navigation, navbar, all the kind of stuff that you'd expect within a theme. Now, if we go back to my input folder, you can see that it's possible to override our theme files by creating a matching file name within here. So you can see that I've overwritten my footer and my sidebar to remove everything. Now, you can see that it's also possible to create pages by doing an about.cs HTML. You can say that this is an about page. It's got some metadata at the top, and this is also going to generate our page. If we go back to our example, you can see that I've got my about page, we've got about here, and all the metadata and the content required to render this page is coming all from this CS.html file. Jumping back to our theme folder, you can see that within here we've got a settings.yaml, and in here we're going to define how things work. So importantly, how we're defining our layout is set right here, how we're setting our site title, all that kind of good stuff. So to reiterate how this default pipeline is working is that the theme installs a bunch of files, and then within our input we add our own custom files, and anything that we want to override we just give it the same name, and job is a good one. Now, as I said, this is running in very simple mode, where we can just convert these CS.html pages, our markdown pages, into files really easily. Now, if you want to use static with a headless CMS, we're going to have to start creating custom pipelines. And when we want to introduce a pipeline, we can't just run in this default mode anymore. And this is why I've created my second sample site to show you how this more complicated way of working works. So just like my markdown static sample site, you can also access my pipeline version from my GitHub, which is johndjones-poc, and this time the repository is called static sample site with pipelines. So the first thing that's worth pointing out about this new sample site can be found within program.cs. So remember, in the markdown version, within program.cs, we called create web. However, because we don't want that default markdown to HTML renderer to run anymore, we need to define our own pipelines, and this is the reason why we need to use create default. Now, another thing that happens within that create web call is that we have all the instructions to launch the preview server. However, when we use create defaults, this isn't available, so we have to manually say that we want to enable a preview server, and this is done by add hosting commands. Now, up to this point, my experience with static was pretty good. That markdown site that you saw earlier took me about an hour or two to create. However, this is where things started to go a little downhill. Now, the reason for this is all around documentation. So, you know that we had that add hosting commands, and this sets the preview server up. If we go to the documentation and look at preview servers, this command isn't mentioned, and we've only got the CLI tool. Now also, there's no actual search within the documentation, which was a massive pain. Now, the other thing which I found is that if you didn't have your launch settings.json, and remember I created my application using a console command, then your preview wasn't going to work. So looking in launch settings, you basically need to set up a profile, you need to give it a command name of project, command line of preview, and off it will go. But these two things are really key, and I wasted about 2 hours just trying to figure this out. And this was a very common theme when I started to create custom pipelines with static, is that the documentation and the examples weren't really comprehensive enough, so I had to spend a lot of time creating the site. Now, for transparency, the markdown site probably took me an hour or two. This pipeline version probably took me something like 2.5 days of full-time work to create, just to do a like-for-like comparison, and it was all mainly to do with lack of documentation examples. And this is definitely something that you need to be aware of when you're planning a project and you're thinking about using static, because if you have to create pipelines, you are going to have to waste a lot of time figuring things out and debugging. And if you simply use something like Next.js or Gatsby, you're not going to have this issue. However, the benefits is that you can use Netlify and .NET to create your websites. So at the moment, it's not perfect. However, for some people, this is going to be a better alternative than going to a default of JavaScript. So with that rant over, let's get back to the code and look at what's going on. So now that we've swapped out create web, create default, if you try to do a .NET run now, nothing is going to happen. And this is because we need to define some pipelines so we can convert our content into web pages. And this is the reason why we now have a folder which is called pipelines. Now, the first thing that's worth pointing out is that for every page that you want to render within your site, you're going to have to create an associated pipeline within this folder. So if we start off by looking at my asset pipeline, you can see here that to create a pipeline, we just inherit from pipeline. With our pipeline now defined, we now need to get our content and turn it into HTML. And we basically do that within some event handlers. So within static, we have 4 main event handlers. or phases. So in the input phase, you basically need to get your content. So this might be reading the markdown files from disk. This could be talking to a CMS, talking to a database, talking to an API, whatever it is. Now, after you've got that data, the next step is to do the process phase. And this is basically going to get your data and convert it into an iDocument, which is basically the static way of processing documents. Then we can do some post-processing. So this is used for modules that need access to the output of your document. And then finally, we've got the output phase. And this is basically where we write our new document to disk. So if we look at the assets pipeline again, this should hopefully make a little bit more sense. So within assets, you can see that we're hooking into the process modules phase. From here, we're going to copy the files, and this is going to copy the files from our input folder into our output folder. So if we look at input right here, you can see that we've got, say, our CSS clean blog CSS. We've got the copy CSS command here. And then within our output, you can see we've got our CSS folder and clean blog. Simples. Now that we've got an understanding about how a simple pipeline works, let's look at a more complicated pipeline. And we're going to look at my home page pipeline. So this is going to render out the home page. Now, straight off, you can see that we're inheriting from pipeline. And in here, you can see that I'm using 3 phases. So input, process modules, and down the bottom, output. Now, within each phase, I'm going to add in some custom modules to do what I need it to do. So within input, you can see that I'm reading in some markdown. Now, in pages home, if I look here, you can see that I've got pages, home, markdown file here. We can see that I'm reading in this file to be used in my pipeline. Now, in a process modules, this is where we're going to add in most of our work. So this phase is where we do the processing of our data into a format that we can render into HTML. And in here, you can see that I've got 4 modules. So first, we're doing extract front matter. So extract front matter, as you'll see from documentation, this is where we're going to read in the information from Markdown. Specifically, we're going to read in the metadata. Now, next up, we've got merge content. So merge content here, this is going to get our view file. So again, if we look within our project directory, you'll see that in inputs, I've got a home.cshtml, and this is the view that we're going to use to render out our page. Then we've got render razor. So render razor again is another module that's going to use the razor view engine to render out our view. Now, static comes with multiple different view engines. So you've got one for rendering out things using handlebars. You've also got one to render out things using Markdown. Now, the last thing is set destination, which you can see here. Now, set destination, this is going to allow you to define what the end HTML file is going to be called. Now, for time, I'm not going to do a complete deep dive into how everything works. However, you kind of get the gist of the layout of a pipeline. And then the final bit down here, output modules, this is where we add in the command to actually write our HTML file. And this means that when this is triggered, if we look in outputs, you can see that we've got index.html and we've got our index.html file here. Right, so I fired up my sample site just so you can see how it renders out. Now, I would say that when I was rendering pages, things were okay. However, as we can see on this page, I'm not just rendering out page content. At the top here, you can see that I'm rendering out a menu. Now, if I click on this listing page, you can see here that I'm rendering out a list of all the different blogs on the website. And just like I struggled to get the preview server working earlier because of lack of documentation, I also encountered a bunch of problems trying to figure out how to render page metadata, how to render the menu, and also just how to access other data within the site. Now, in the end, I came up with a solution that works. So let's jump back to the source code so you can see how I solved this problem. So the first challenge I needed to solve was how could I get information about other pages that I create in the site. Now, my first thought was just to add in every single markdown file within input modules. However, this wasn't ideal. Now, the main reason for this is that I needed to create different view models based on different pages. So I basically needed to create a pipeline per page type I wanted to render. So after a lot of Googling, searching, I managed to find something within static.core which will help. And that is this list of dependencies. Now, I couldn't find any reference to this within the documentation. However, if we look on the top line here, line 10 in my blog listing, you can see that I've got dependencies add, and I'm adding in the blog pipeline right here. So this is a key thing to know about when you're using static. So what this line is doing is that we're saying that we're adding a dependency in our blog listing onto this blog pipeline. And then if we look in a blog pipeline, you can see that this pipeline is basically getting all of our posts and then converting them into pages. So what happens within blog listing now is that when we add this dependencies to the blog pipeline, this is going to run first. And then when we try and access the output pages in our context right here, we're going to have a list of all of the blog pages as well as the current page. And what we can do is, using destination full path, we can filter out the pages that have blog in it. So now I have access to all my blogs within my blog listing page. So trying to figure out that dependency stuff was a pain. However, it was much easier than trying to figure out how to render the menu. So the big issue with the menu is that it needs to render on every single page. Now, my first thought would be, I'll make use of dependencies and I'll just put dependencies everywhere and link everything to everything. Now, the big issue with this is that on the home page, if you're referencing the blog listing page, but then on the blog listing page, you're referencing the home page using dependencies, you're going to get a cyclic error and everything's going to blow up. Now, this is the reason why I had to come up with an alternative solution. So from my blog listing pipeline, you can see that I'm inheriting from layout pipeline. So layout pipeline is a custom pipeline I created, and in it, I've just added dependencies to a menu pipeline. Yes, BAF. Now, if I look in my menu pipeline, you will see that I'm creating a normal menu pipeline. This time I'm getting all the pages that could be used within the menu. In here, I'm doing some filtering, but then I'm rendering every single one of my menu items out into a folder called menu. So, yep, if I look within my output folder, you can see here that I've got this folder called menu, and in this menu, I've got all the pages that I'm going to use in the menu being rendered here. So if we look back in our website again, you can see, I've got my home, I've got my blog listing here, and that's basically how I'm accessing that information. So then going in my navbar view, you'll see that I can then iterate through my output pages and I can filter the results. So in my example, I've got a property called isPage. So if I look within, say, my input folder and I go to my pages, you can see listing has show in navbar equals true. It's also isPage equals true. And then if I've got in my posts, I don't have that isPage equals true. Now, I wouldn't say this should prevent you from using static. However, it's definitely something to be aware of, as that when you start building your website in production and you start getting into these niche use cases, then expect to bump your head against a wall every so often. And when you're planning your project, expect it to take a little bit longer in consequence. So I'm hoping it's come across that I think that static is a really powerful framework that has a lot of potential. Now, things definitely aren't going to be all plain sailing. We could do with better documentation, better samples. We could also have better out-of-the-box integrations for CMSs for things like Umbraco or maybe Optimizely. However, I want to finish the video with the best benefit from switching to static, in my opinion, and that is hosting. Okay, to start things off, what you want to do is create a brand new file inside of your project, call it netlify.toml. Now this is where you add in your CI/CD pipeline instructions, and from here we do a build, we do publish equals output folder, and then the command we want to run is .NET run. Next, we just jump over to Netlify, so netlify.com, log in, and you can log in using your GitHub credentials. Once you get here, you'll go to your team overview, click on create new site. When you add a new site, import an existing project. From here, deploy with GitHub. This is going to allow you to authenticate. Then you can search your repos. From here, you just basically need to decide who can access it, which branch you want to deploy. Now, as long as you have your Netlify TOML, all of this stuff should be published automatically for you. And then right down the bottom, you just need to deploy your project. And it really is that simple. Now, next, I want to share a quick tip for .NET developers. Now, because we're deploying on Unix, remember that all of your files and how things work are very case sensitive. So as you can see from my build failing previously, if you look down, you can see that I've got an error somewhere, that we can't find layout.cshtml. Now, the issue with this is that you can see here that I'm using a capital L, and then in my file, I've changed it now, but if I do a search for layout, you can see that, I was using a lowercase l. So you need to make sure that your name here actually matches with the file name that you're going to use. Because if you have any case sensitive issues between the reference in your code and the actual file name, your build is going to fail in Netlify. Yes, it really was that simple and quick to deploy that site on Netlify. And you can see now why I prefer this compared to classic web hosting or going through the palaver of Azure. And if you agree with me, then static can be a complete game changer for people who just like .NET. They don't want to fiddle around with JavaScript moving forward when it comes to website development. Now, personally, I can see a lot of benefits of using static, and if you agree with me and you'd like to see more content around static or creating SSG websites with .NET, then let me know. Otherwise, I'm not going to bother. I created a video about 2 months ago all about Gatsby. No one watched it. It took me ages. So unless I get feedback, I'm not going to do another video on static. So let me know. Otherwise, if you haven't already and you love .NET, websites, development, then don't forget to smash on subscribe so you can see my video next Sunday. Also, if you have loved learning about static, click on like, hook us up, do a brother a favor. Otherwise, if you want to learn a little bit more about what's coming up in .NET 8, I've created a video and the link of which is on the screen right now. So click on that to learn about what's coming up. Otherwise, have an amazing day and see you next Sunday. Happy coding.